I've been playing the Caro-Kann for a while now, and I used to hate facing the fantasy variation. It felt aggressive and tricky, and I just had no idea how to develop my pieces or what my plan should be, but now I love it when my opponent plays the fantasy. I learned a setup that has some really sharp and fun and dynamic ideas, and although it does require accuracy, it doesn't require like really deep memorization the way some openings do. So in this video, I'll break down the fantasy variation, what makes it so tricky and why I struggled with it, and the setup that you can use to handle it with confidence. So let's dive in. The Caro-Kann opening is an opening for black where you respond to e4 with c6. And there's a bunch of different directions this can take, but for the fantasy variation, we then have d4, d5, and f3. This is the defining move of the fantasy variation, is f3. And the idea is that we're reinforcing, or white is reinforcing the e4 pawn with the f pawn. And so if black takes, for example, then white recaptures, and now white has two central pawns and black only has one, and it's still on the home square. And so that's kind of the main idea. And what I used to do against the fantasy variation is I used to play G6, sorry. And G6, the idea is I'm going to fianchetto this bishop, and then I'm going to kind of figure it out from there. And I never really knew the exact plans. There is a lot of theory around this plan, and I think a lot of people use it very successfully. Like maybe we push this pawn eventually and get the knight out here, castle short, and the queen can often sort of come out to this side and maybe target this pawn and so on. But one issue is the light squares on the king side, white is covering them pretty well, so it's hard to develop this bishop. And so I never really totally learned how to handle this particularly well. And so I learned this other idea. And it's not necessarily like the top move according to the engine or according to the database, but it does work pretty well, especially at my level around the, 1700 kind of level. And if you just know kind of the key moves and key ideas along with the common mistakes to avoid, then it can actually get you into a really nice position and a really nice game. Now, it is pretty sharp, and there are some spots where you have to play exactly the right move, otherwise everything will kind of go sideways on you. So if you prefer like slower maneuvering chess or more system openings, then this might not be the one for you, but it can lead to a very dynamic and interesting game. And so the move is to just capture anyway. I just got done explaining that, the whole point of the fantasy variation is if black captures, then white has this great center, right? And this is true, but there's a way to play against this immediately if you know what you're doing. The first key move to play is e5 right away. What we want to do is we want to strike at the center, and we're going to exploit the fact that white now has weak dark squares around the king. And we don't want to kind of play slowly and give white time to develop and consolidate and kind of, reinforce the center. We need to strike right away. Now, there is only one move for white that works here. That may not be technically like 100% accurate, but in practice, there's basically just one move, and it is knight f3. So let's see what happens if white does anything else. So let's say white were to play c3 instead, something like this. Well, again, the problem is these dark squares around the king are very weak, and so we are going to play queen h4 check immediately. And then white is already in a worse position. They're probably going to have to move the king somewhere and lose their right to castle. If they don't, if they play something like g3, then we capture on e4 and white is losing their rook. And so basically knight f3 works because it covers these dark squares and prevents our queen from coming in. And that's pretty much sort of the only option here for white that really works well. And so if white doesn't play that, if white plays c3, or like another thing that might be tempting is just to take. Now, taking, it means that we could trade queens here, and white is going to lose their ability to castle. But I mean, we can also just play queen h4 check right away, just like we showed just a minute ago. So, punishing white for leaving those dark squares weak is something that you should definitely do if they do not play knight f3. So now there are a few ideas for black here. The one that I prefer is bishop g4, because it kind of immediately puts a pin on this knight, that means that we're actually attacking this pawn because the knight is no longer defending and we have two attackers, right? So this is where I think, like, if you watch different videos or if you look in the database, like, some people have other moves here that they like rather than bishop g4, but this is the one that I really enjoy, and I'll show you kind of the lines that we get out of this. Now, the most common move for white here, and the most common idea, is bishop c4, or a similar idea around bishop c4. And what white is trying to do is put pressure on the f7 pawn. And there are a few different things that white can do about this, and we'll see that, the queen can eventually come to b3, white can castle, getting this semi-open f-file with the rook, and we're going to learn how to deal with all of that. But just before we do, let's look at just sort of a quick couple of sidelines. If white doesn't do something sharp like that and just plays a slow move like maybe bishop e2, this is actually a mistake, because now we can actually just trade this bishop off and win this pawn, right? Because the pawn was being defended by the knight was pinned, all that. So that doesn't work for white. So seeing that, what if white instead plays bishop e3 and defends this pawn with another piece? That's fine, but now it allows us to get some really good pressure right away. We can play knight f6, putting pressure on the e-pawn, and then if knight c3, we can immediately pin that knight, and we're still putting pressure on this pawn, and all of a sudden, we are developed very aggressively. Like, yes, white has this strong center, but we're immediately putting a lot of pressure on it, and we can continue to kind of lean into that. We can castle, we can bring out this knight, maybe put the queen on b6, possibly. I'm not sure, it depends on the line, but this seems like a very pleasant position for black. So let's reset. And okay, in this position, like I said, the most common idea is bishop c4. I should also mention that c3 is also a pretty common move here. It's actually the second most common according to the database. But this is generally going to, like, the idea here is generally to bring the queen out and then maybe also to bring the bishop out. And so it's going to most likely transpose into the main line that I'm about to show you. So bishop c4. And let's say we just don't take this threat seriously. Let's say we play something like knight f6. This is a blunder because white can capture right away. And then after we recapture with the king, the knight captures on e4 or on e5 with another check. And then we move the king out of the way and we lose our bishop. And of course the knight is being backed up by the queen. And now we're down 2 pawns of material. And we're down 2 pawns, we can't castle. And all of our counterplay against white's center is gone. We've lost even our e-pawn, and so white has a huge center. White's going to castle, have the semi-open f-file, and we're in pretty rough shape as black. So back here with bishop c4, we need to take this move seriously. And this is where we have a key move that as soon as that bishop goes to c4, you need to play knight d7. And the reason this works is because knight d7 is defending this pawn. And you might think, well, maybe the tactic works anyway because this knight can just go here. But it doesn't. And actually, it's interesting. I learned this variation, and I didn't actually learn why bishop takes f7 in this position doesn't work until I was playing a game, and my opponent played that because he thought that it worked as well. And it's not too hard to figure out over the board, which I did. But this is what happens. So captures, which is a blunder, capture back with the king. And then with this move, with check, we can actually capture with our queen, even though it's covered by the bishop, because our bishop is also hitting white's queen. And so after takes and takes and takes, now we're actually up a knight for a pawn through all of those trades. And, neither side can castle, and we still have some issues with our development, but we'll get our pieces out somewhere and get the rooks out, and we'll have a pretty nice game from here. Okay, so back to the bishop c4 move and knight d7. Now, white has a few different ideas here that work. The main line is castles to bring the rook onto this semi-open f-file and hit this pawn, and we'll look at that in just a second. But another move that I want to look at is c3. The idea behind c3 is the queen is going to come to b3, and now the queen is adding extra pressure onto this pawn also, but the queen is also hitting this b7 pawn. And so, again, there are a few different options here, but the one I really like is bishop h5. The idea is this continues to have pressure along this diagonal, but the bishop is also defending this f-pawn. And it tends to work pretty well and just kind of hold everything together. If queen b3, now our idea is we can put our queen on c7, and we can castle long, and then maybe start launching some kind of attack on the king side. And so it's, you know, the game goes on from here. There's probably like lots of additional theory that we can dig into here, but this is kind of as far as I go, and I've had some pretty decent success in these sorts of lines. So the key moves that we've learned so far are, you know, as soon as it looks like this bishop and maybe queen idea is going to start to happen, we need to move knight d7. And then if it looks like the queen is going to line up as well, we just pull our bishop back and add another defender onto this pawn. There's another idea here worth mentioning, which is interesting. And it's bishop d6. And I think this might be like the top database move or the top engine move or something. Anyway, I don't really understand this one. So apparently after bishop d6 and the queen comes down, now we can put the queen on e7. And I assume that's the reason for doing bishop d6 first, so we can put the queen here, defend this pawn, and, you know, the bishop isn't blocked in. But then the queen can capture here. We can attack with the rook because of this bishop here as well. We lose another pawn, and then we trade over here. We bring our knight out. The bishop comes down to pin. We castle. And I don't know, the engine or the database or something says bishop b3 is best here. Now, in this position, we are down 2 pawns. But if I turn on the engine here, it's like -2. So the engine says that this is significantly better for black, even though black is down 2 pawns. So I'm guessing it's because our pieces are really active, like white is struggling to develop. And also our king is super safe compared to this king. Like, what's this king going to do? Like, maybe the knight needs to come out and then castle long, but then, you know, we can bring this rook out. Like, is the queen trapped? I'm not sure that the queen is trapped. Maybe the queen is almost trapped, right? Like, if I bring my rook and then the queen goes up here, I'm not really sure why this position is so much better for black. So if you know why this position is so much better for black, definitely leave a comment and let me know, because I'm very interested to understand this better. But anyway, that's why instead of bishop d6, I prefer something like bishop h5, because it's a simple idea and it works. Okay, so finally, way back in this position, what do we do if white castles? Well, again, there's a pretty simple idea. White is trying to add pressure with the rook onto this pawn, and so we just simply put our knight in the way, block the rook. Knight g to f6, right? And as I said, this blocks the rook, and it also kind of adds some pressure over here, and it's a good developing move. We're getting closer to being able to bring the bishop out and castling, getting our king safe, and this pressure on the f-pawn doesn't really amount to anything. Okay, so what if in this position, white plays something like c3? Well, same idea as before. We're just going to drop our bishop back, add another defender, and then, you know, either we'll bring this bishop out and castle, or maybe we can bring the queen out, especially if, you know, queen comes to b3 and we can castle long and launch an attack over on this side. We have a few different options, and they're all pretty decent. Now, after castling back in this position, it's worth noting that white has a few other options, but none of them are particularly tricky or need like really deep analysis or anything like that. Like, for example, white could capture this pawn, and there are a few different options here, but the simplest one is we can just take the knight, and now we're hitting the queen, and so either white has to take this way and open up their king, or white takes with the queen, and we just go up here with the knight, and that's also with a tempo on the queen, plus we're hitting the bishop, and so we just kind of make these natural moves, and it tends to work. There's another one that I had kind of learned here, which is interesting. You can just take with the knight right away, but then white has the ability to trade the queens. And so one option, if you don't want to trade off your bishop and you want to take right away, is you can actually start with queen b6, because that's a check. And then after moving out of the check, then you can take. And this is just a way to prevent trading the queens if you want to do it this way and you also don't want to trade off your bishop. So there are a few options. Another move for white in this position is just to develop the bishop to g5, pinning this knight. And we just develop as well. We're going to castle, and, you know, the knight is already defended by the other knight, so we can move our queen out here or here. And you know, life goes on. We're just gonna keep kind of putting pressure. And the queen out on b6 also puts some pressure on this pawn as well. And so, you know, and the pawn is also pinned to the king. So there's just some options to kind of try to undermine this kind of strong center from white with the way we've developed and the way that we're kind of pushing forward into the middle game here. So let's just go back. I'm going to go all the way back to here. After this bishop g4 move, now, of course, you know, dig through the database, see if there are any things in there that you also are, you know, worried about and want to look at. But basically, the key ideas are, if it looks like this bishop is going to come down here, or if this bishop does come down here, then we're going to move the knight to d7. And also, if c3 happens in this position, we also move the knight to d7 because c3 is kind of indicating that these moves are going to happen later. If at some point white castles, then we're going to move the knight to f6. If the bishop comes down and c3 has happened, we need to make sure that our bishop goes down to h5 to defend this pawn for when the queen comes. And then if that happens, we're going to move our queen out of the way and castle long. And those are basically the key ideas. And if you can remember those, then this is actually going to get you into a pretty decent position. You're not going to win every game. It's not like a, you know, crazy opening trap that's going to be like a knockout punch for white. But it's a pretty interesting, fun, and dynamic position that I've been really enjoying playing into. So that is the Caro-Kann Fantasy Variation. These ideas that I've shared should get you started playing some games, getting some experience. You might have to, you might get into a bad line in some games and have to kind of look through the database and see what the correct moves were in that case. But again, this is a good starting point and kind of jumping off point to get you started playing games in this variation. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have played this line against the fantasy, or maybe you've played something else against it that has worked well for you, leave a comment. I'm very interested to hear about your experience, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you on the next one.